Hi, I'm Mike Beliveau, and today I'd like to talk to you about one of my favorite Old West lawmen, Jeff Milton. Now, Jeff Milton was the real deal. You know, in an era where a lot of so-called gunfighters became famous on pretty slim resumes, Jeff Milton really did it all. He was a consummate lawman, and he served from the Texas Rangers in the 1870s right up to the Border Patrol in the 1930s, and everything in between. He was a Wells Fargo agent. He was essentially a manhunter for Wells Fargo. He was the chief of police of El Paso. He was a deputy sheriff in New Mexico. He was a Stockmen's Association detective. He had many gunfights, and he's just a fascinating character. Now, Jeff Milton killed at least 8 men in documented gunfights, and at least 2 more possibles. And those were in cases where he was part of a posse where so many people were shooting, it's pretty hard to determine who landed the fatal shot. He also wounded 2 other men. And when I say at least, that's because there was no brag in Jeff. He just did not like to talk about his exploits. And a lot of them just went unmentioned because there were cases where he thought it was best just to bury the bodies and move on. And there's no doubt there are those that we will never know about. Not that he was some psychopathic murderer. He wasn't Colonel Charlie Askins or anything. In fact, he had a code. But Jeff preferred to be discreet. And he didn't waste time. As Jeff Milton famously said, "I never killed a man who didn't need killing." But if a man needed killing, Jeff didn't waste much time about it. Jeff was only 18 years old when he joined the Rangers, well below the official age of 21. He lied about his age, was duly sworn in, and entered the Ranger service, served for about 3 years. He went on from there to become a deputy sheriff in New Mexico, served a stint under Commodore Perry Owens, among other people. Went to work as a Stockmen's Association detective and had some interesting adventures there, and then he became a Wells Fargo agent where basically he operated as a manhunter for them. He became the chief of police of El Paso, Texas, and he was hired to basically clean up that town. And that's when characters were there like John Wesley Hardin, John Selman. It was a pretty tough place. After that, he did a brief stint as a deputy U.S. Marshal, and then he went back to working for Wells Fargo as both a detective and as a freight agent guard, express car guard. And then he became a mounted Chinese inspector on the Arizona border, which was the precursor of the Border Patrol. And in 1904, he was personally appointed to be one of the first Border Patrol inspectors by President Theodore Roosevelt. And he stayed with the Border Patrol into the 1930s until he was retired because of his age. He had to retire. He had his last gunfight at age 57, which he won. So, just a very interesting guy, had a fascinating career. If Hollywood was smart, they would take a look at this guy and you could make several movies out of different parts of his life. He's just that fascinating. He deserves to be better known than he is. It's quite different from what it evolved into in Hollywood movies, where 2 guys with steel-lined holsters face each other down across a dusty street and, draw their guns and 300th of a second, just crazy stuff, shoot from the hip and drop each other. So it was not like that. When people said Jeff Milton was fast then, what they meant is when he decided that gun needed to come out, it came out. There was no hesitation. When he decided a man needed to be killed, that gun came out and he killed him. There was no hesitation, no thinking about it. He just did it. And that was a mark of successful gunmen, like Wild Bill Hickok, as a for instance, that when they saw the need to shoot, they just shot. They didn't debate the morality of it. There was no internal thing that holds most of us human beings back from killing another human being. Those guys just don't have it. And it's a good thing they're on our side, because the guys who don't have it on the other side are just pure killers. So, like I say, Jeff said he never shot a man, he never killed a man who didn't need killing. But if he saw somebody who needed killing, he didn't waste much time on killing them. So, let's talk about Jeff Milton's guns. In 1877, at the age of 16, Jeff, who was the son of the Confederate governor of Florida, left home after his father's death. His family fell on, hard times after his father died. He left home in Florida for Texas, where his sister had married into a good Texas family. His sister Fanny's husband was part of the Yarborough clan. Jeff moved in with them. They owned a ranch, also a store. Jeff started clerking in the store. Then he went to work on the ranch. He did that for a couple of years, and he had been presented by his brother-in-law, Yarborough's brother, with a Winchester model 1873 carbine in 4440. And he used that gun while cowboying. He did a lot of hunting. And at the age of 18, Jeff decided to join the Texas Rangers. Now, he was well known in political circles in Austin because Yarborough was well connected. So he showed up with several letters of introduction from highly placed Texans, including a former attorney general. And when he was signed in, the head of the Texas Rangers looked at him and said, "How old are you?" And Jeff had grown a mustache just to look older. And Jeff said, 21. And the head of the Rangers said, "You don't look it, but I think you'll make a Ranger." And they swore him in. So he had his rifle, but Ranger armament at the time called for a rifle and a handgun, a Colt single-action army. And the regs called for a single-action army and 45 Colt, but in point of fact, if you're willing to supply your own ammunition or use some other readily available ammunition, they really didn't care. So Jeff needed a handgun. And he saw a beauty at Pet Mackey's store in Austin, which was a gun shop that the Rangers used to order most of their guns for their men. Because they would order a handgun for a Ranger that needed one and then dock it from his pay over a couple of installments to get it paid off. So Jeff saw a beautiful silver-plated Colt single action of 4440, and he bought it. And Jeff said, "I thought I was just the king bee. 44 caliber 6-gun, 44 caliber rifle, both shooting the same ammunition. I thought I had it made." But as it turned out, that gun had a defect. And in fact, what it probably was an enlarged firing pinhole. And I've had this happen, not on Colts, but on Ubertis that I've owned, that over the time, the firing pinhole gets peened open a little bit, drags on the cases. So in order to fix that, you stone it down, and every time you do that, the hole gets a little bit larger. And if it's large enough, under recoil, the primer will flow back into that hole a bit and totally lock up the gun so you can't cock it again. And that's what was happening to Jeff with every shot. So that's obviously not a gun that a lawman can use to defend his life. So he was in a dilemma. He didn't want to sell it to any of the boys in his outfit because it didn't work. And you might say the good thing to do would have been to take it back to Pet Mecky's, but Jeff had a different idea. So he had his friends talk up that gun big time around Fort Concho, which is where they were bivouacked with his ranger company at the time. And just tell everybody, wow, what a great gun Jeff has. It shoots 44 40s. Beautiful silver plated gun. So word got around, and there was a gambler there named Buddy Carr. And Buddy supplemented his gambling income with rustling and highway robbery. But they couldn't pin anything on him. But the Rangers were pretty sure that he was a bad guy. So they were talking this up to Buddy, and Buddy wanted that gun. And like a lot of us when we just want a gun, he wanted it bad, and he wanted it now. And Jeff didn't think he wanted to part with such a great gun, but Buddy was insistent. So Buddy owned a Colt Peacemaker in .45 Colt caliber. And that gun had walnut grips that were inlaid with the suits from a deck of cards, club, spades, hearts, diamonds, in little silver inlays set into the grip panels of the gun. And he said that he would trade that straight up to Jeff for Jeff's new gun. And Jeff said, well, I don't know if I want to do that. But eventually he said, okay, if you really want it. And they traded guns, and Jeff had a gun that worked, and Buddy had a gun that didn't. And what Buddy ultimately thought about that trade is not recorded, because Buddy might have been at a slight disadvantage since Jeff had 30 Texas Rangers at his back on this, and none of them really liked Buddy. So I think Buddy probably kept his mouth shut and found somebody else to swindle with that gun and got another one himself. So now Jeff was armed as a Texas Ranger, and he was ready to really start his law enforcement career. He used that Buddy Carr Colt in his first gunfight, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. He moved on to New Mexico, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because he did have one notorious gunfight in New Mexico and had a few other posse actions. But in this gunfight, he was riding with a partner, and he was ambushed by 3 bandits. And they shot his horse dead out from under him, which landed on his leg, pinning him. And also, he took a bullet in the leg during that process. But he was able to get his 1873 carbine out and engage the bad guys. And as Jeff said, and at that point, a whole lot of shooting went on. And those bad guys were never seen again. Now, I'm going to tell you one other example of something that happened to Jeff in New Mexico that did not involve a shooting, but did involve kind of an unusual gun. So when Jeff was working as a detective for the Stockmen's Association, he was directed to go undercover to the Thompson Ranch, where Thompson was suspected of rustling, but Jeff needed to catch him in the act. So he got a job as a ranch hand working for Thompson. He'd been working for a couple of weeks. And unfortunately, a member of the Stockmen's Association who did not know that Thompson was the target of the investigation was friends with Thompson. And he remarked to him that Jeff Milton was after a rustler in Thompson's neighborhood, and if he saw him, he ought to help him out. Well, Thompson put 2 and 2 together because the rustler in his neighborhood was him. So one night, Jeff came back from his cowboy work. He put his horse in the stable, put his saddle on the porch of the house under the overhang with his rifle in the scabbard, took off his gun belt, hung him from the pommel, and his hat, and he went in to have supper with the family, as he did every night. Well, when he went into the dining room, he could hear in the adjoining room Thompson talking to his 2 sons, telling them that Milton was an undercover detective and that they needed to kill him and get rid of him that night. Lucky for Jeff, he always carried a Colt shopkeeper's model in a shoulder holster under his shirt. And shirts, of course, were much blousier then, and they were covered by a vest. So he unbuttoned his shirt and got out that shopkeeper's model. And when Thompson and his sons walked in the dining room, Jeff said, let's discuss this before we get too hasty. He directed one of Thompson's boys to go out and saddle his horse and, bring it to the front door. Then he backed them up against the wall, took their guns away, backed out, mounted his horse, and got the heck out of there, and decided that he was not going to catch Thompson in the act, and discretion was a better part of valor. So we know he carried shopkeeper's models as a hideout gun for a good bit of his life. Now, Jeff was a fan of Colt's single-action army revolver. As I told you, his first one was Buddy Carr's with the suits of cards inlaid in the handle. He used that in his first gunfight as a Texas Ranger. Milton was with two other Rangers to arrest W.P. Patterson, a rancher who was actually a pretty prominent citizen, who had been on a drunken tear for days and was suspected of shooting up the town. So they approached him to arrest him and basically, chain him to a tree to cool him down. But Patterson was having none of it. And he pulled his gun, fired a shot, did not hit anybody, but Jeff responded immediately by drawing his gun and shooting Patterson square in the chest and killing him on the spot. And that was the first gunfight that Jeff was in. We don't know whether that was a short-barrel Colt or a long-barrel Colt that he used. We just know that it was a Colt. We know that Jeff had a preference for 5.5-inch barreled and 4 3/4-inch barreled Colts for all of his life. But I have seen, though I was not able to find a picture of it, unfortunately. Again, I used to have a picture of it that I got from the Arizona Historical Society, but I'm unable to locate it, I'm sorry to say, of Jeff in the desert with a 7.5-inch barrel gun. So I know he had at least one. But I've seen other pictures, and I've got a picture here in the desert where his holster clearly has a shorter barrel Colt in it. So we know he had a number of Colts. In fact, when he was a marshal or a chief of police of El Paso, Texas, he used this Colt, which was a 4 3/4-inch 45 Colt gun, and he used that to kill Martin McRose right at the border, just after he crossed the bridge from Juarez into El Paso. Shot him in the heart, though McRose managed to fire another shot after being hit, and George Scarborough, who was Milton's partner at the time, fired a second shot into his chest, and that was all she wrote. But he had basically 2 bullets in his heart. But it just goes to show a determined opponent can still get a shot off even after they're hit with a fatal. Now, Jeff had a lot of standard Colts, off the shelf, out of the box Colts, but he also had at least 2 custom-made Colts. Jeff's first custom-made Colt was one of the rare shopkeeper models, made without an ejector rod, no ejector rod assembly, no place to put an ejector rod. And it had a 4 3/4-inch barrel, which is a little bit long for the shopkeeper's models. But it's a beautiful gun. It's factory engraved by Cuno Helfrich. It's in 45 Colt. The Colt letter is available for it. States it was ordered in 1916 for Jeff Milton. And it was delivered to A. Steinway and Company in Tucson, Arizona. So just a beautiful gun, beautifully engraved. Kind of a barbecue gun, but had pearl grips with a carved steer's head on one panel. Beautiful pearl grips. So this was quite a fancy gun for Jeff, and we can call it one of his barbecue guns. But it was a beautiful gun. About the same time, he was gifted with another Colt single action. In 1916, John Greenway gifted Jeff Milton with a beautiful Colt single action in 38-40 with a 5.5-inch barrel, level C engraving from the factory, beautiful pearl grips that were monogrammed with Jeff Milton's initials, and a silver Colt medallion. And the gun was silver plated throughout. Just a gorgeous gun. This was the gun that in retirement Jeff kept with him all the time. So this obviously meant a lot to him. We know he liked 45 Colt, but apparently this 38-40 was just fine with him. And he carried this gun for the rest of his life until he died in his 80s. And it's just a beautiful example of the gunmaker's art. Now, even though Jeff's preference clearly was for Colt single action armies, even after more modern guns were available, he was a gun guy, and he owned and carried other guns. In 1903, Jeff was prospecting in Baja, California. At the time, he used to go into Los Angeles, California for supplies, and on one trip, he saw a Smith & Wesson double action. Now, unfortunately, Jeff didn't stipulate to posterity which Smith & Wesson he wanted. But given it was 1903, it can pretty much only be the Smith & Wesson Military and Police in .38 Special, which was a very new gun at the time and a new cartridge, and it was becoming extremely popular. And since the triple lock in .44 Special wouldn't come out for 3 more years, I think we can be pretty sure that the Smith & Wesson in question was a military and police model. And Jeff had a hankering, and he told his prospecting partner that he was going to buy one. And his partner Dave Morgana said, "Cap Milton, don't be too hasty about that. I think I can get you one. Just give me a little time." Well, the next morning, Morgana shows up with a lovely Smith & Wesson and presents it to Jeff free of charge. And Jeff was wise enough not to ask where he acquired it. Though the smart money is that he took it off of a policeman that he had little respect for. I'll just leave it at that. But Jeff did not have a bout of ethics over that, and he accepted the gun. And Jeff was well known for an incident that happened with yet a different gun. And this was Jeff's last gunfight. It was on Friday, November 2nd, in 1917. Jeff was 56. I think earlier I said he was 57. He was 56 when that happened. And this all started because a Gleason, Arizona man named Fred Koch, K-O-C-H. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, the Koch or Koch family can let me know. Maybe I'll say Koch. Sounds a little better. Fred Koch was robbing the First National Bank of Tombstone. And Fred was not the luckiest of men. So he waited and waited until the head teller. So Fred waited and waited until the chief cashier, T.R. Brandt, was all alone in the bank. At that point, he walked in and pointed a .41 caliber Army pistol at Brandt, which was likely a Colt model 1908 Army Special, and directed Brandt to open the safe and give him all of the money inside. Brandt had a shotgun under the counter, though, and he elected to go for it instead of opening the safe. Koch shot him, and in short order, he died from his wounds. But after Koch shot him, he went around the counter, tried to open the safe himself, could not get in, got no money at all, realized that people were going to be responding to that gunshot, and he took off into the Sonoran Desert. Now he's a murderer and a failed bank robber. Unfortunately for Koch, Jeff Milton was having lunch in Tombstone with his friend, who was the undersheriff of Cochise County. It's Guy Welch. He and Guy ran out into the street and got in Jeff's Model T. With Guy driving, they started following Koch's tracks into the desert. And in pretty short order, they caught up with him. Jeff jumped out of the car, demanded that Koch stop, give himself up. Koch did not, and Jeff shot him. Now, as luck would have it, the shot caught him in the shoulder. Koch fell to the ground crying like a baby, surrendered, and was taken into custody. Later, during his murder trial, the judge was questioning Milton on the stand after he gave his testimony. He said, "Mr. Milton, were you trying to wing him, or were you shooting to kill?" And Jeff said, "I always shoot to kill." And the judge laughed, and Koch, who, by the way, was crying at the defense table, said to Koch, "Son, you don't know what a lucky man you are, because you are probably the only man who's ever survived being shot at by Jeff Milton." Not that that did Koch any good, because ultimately he did not survive his murder verdict. But that was Jeff's last gunfight, and the gun he used was a 1907 Savage semi-automatic in .380 caliber, which is quite an interesting choice. But at the time, those little Savages were all the rage. And once again, Jeff was a trendy guy. And since he was just going to lunch, wasn't expecting to be in a gunfight, he was just carrying a little personal protection with him. And he used that to see justice served. So a good day done in Jeff Milton's last gunfight. Now, of course, most of us, when we think of Old West gunfighters, we think about handguns. But they used long guns when it was appropriate as well, and certainly Jeff Milton did too. I told you previously that his first gun was a model 1873 Winchester rifle. And he used that in several gunfights, in several posse actions. So he certainly got his money's worth out of that gun. We also know that Milton owned a trapdoor Springfield 1873 government rifle, single shot. Now, we don't know if he used that in any gunfights, per se, in any of his manhunts, because the only times he talked about it was as a hunting rifle, which he used it to drop quite a bit of big game. But whether or not he dropped any two-legged game with that, I could not tell you. Being a gun guy, Jeff Milton undoubtedly owned many other rifles that he just didn't discuss with his biographer, or no one mentioned specifically. And we'll probably never know what most of them were. But we are lucky enough to have this photograph. And I showed you a black and white version earlier. This is a colorized version. But in this photograph of Jeff out in the desert, he's clearly posed with a model 1886 Winchester and .45-70. And you can see the big rifle rounds on his belt. So we can pretty safely say he owned a .45-70 Winchester lever action among his other guns. Beyond that, it's certainly hard to say about rifles. The final gun that Jeff is well known for is a model 1887 Winchester lever action shotgun in 10 gauge. Jeff really liked that lever action gun. And when he became the chief of police for El Paso, Texas, he bought a number of those guns and stashed them at different strategic places around the town so he could get his hands on one quickly if he needed it for big trouble. And the model 1887 features in probably Jeff's most famous gunfight, which is known as the Fairbanks fight. It was in Fairbanks, Arizona in 1900. Jeff was acting as an express agent for Wells Fargo, and he wasn't supposed to be working that night. There was another guy who basically asked Jeff to switch nights with him because he had to sit up with his wife, who was ill. So Jeff did. And that ended up being a very bad thing for the bad guys, because they would not have attacked the train if they'd have known that Jeff was the express agent, because that's just a death sentence. But they didn't know, so the Burt Alvord gang, and Burt was a lawman gone bad, attacked the express car with high-powered rifles, probably 30-30s. And Jeff was caught off guard. He didn't have his handgun with him, but he had his Model 1887 shotgun close at hand. But he was badly wounded. The bones in his left arm were shattered, and he was partially crippled in that arm for the rest of his life. But he was bleeding out when the bad guys stormed the train after shooting him. But he had that 1887, and he used it before he passed out. He killed three-fingered Jack Dunlap, and he wounded badly. He badly wounded Tom Bravo Juan Yoaz, and then he passed out from blood loss. And the bad guys thought he was dead, but he had thrown away the keys to the express box and safe, so they were totally frustrated. They could get no money out of the robbery, and they hastily beat a retreat with empty hands. So Jeff saved the cargo, but eventually he had to undergo a number of operations, and he had a fight just to keep his arm. They wanted to take it off, and it ended up being, as I said, mostly paralyzed for the rest of his life. But luckily it was his left arm, and he could shoot a six-gun just as well as he ever could, and he taught himself to shoot a rifle basically one-handed, to use whatever rest he could, and to do the same thing with a shotgun. And he actually remained a pretty good wing shot for the rest of his life, though he preferred automatic shotguns later in his life, semi-automatics, because obviously he couldn't pump them or do much of anything else with them. But those were the guns that Jeff used. Now, a lot of people, as I said, don't know who Jeff Milton is, and I feel bad about that. So this video probably won't be as popular as, say, the Doc Holliday video, because he's a name brand. But if you like this and you'd like to know more, I would love to do a video going through each of the gunfights that Jeff Milton had, which I think are fascinating. And if that's something that you would like to learn about, just let me know in the comments. And I'm ready to go. So just let me know. And I hope you like this. And if you're interested in learning more about Jeff Milton, there is a biography of him written by J. Everett Halley. And it's available online now. I mean, I've had my copy, since I was in junior high. It was written in the 40s. It's called Jeff Milton, A Good Man with a Gun. And it is well worth a read if you want to learn more about a really fascinating guy. So that's all for now. Until next time, bye.